The next thing I want to talk about is some political geography in this realm, and just a refresher on some terminology that what we call countries, these are states. States mean places with sovereignty or political control, boundaries, and so on. So the United States is actually a state. Russia is a state. Another concept that is not quite the same is the concept of nations. These are cohesive groups of people, and there are cases where you have nations of people that don't necessarily have their own state, or they don't align well with country borders, in other words. So to understand how the nations and states align, it's important to take a step back and talk about, well, who was politically in charge of this realm for a long period of time before we have the modern borders that we have today. And it starts, we can kind of step back and look at the Ottoman Empire. This is sort of the widest extent of the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s, and it really covers most of the realm, at least where most of the people live anyway. So most of the realm was controlled by this large empire until 1923, or till the end of World War I, maybe. That's a good way to understand it. Because the Ottoman Empire was amongst the losing parties of World War I, and after the war, a lot of its territories were divided up amongst the countries that were the winners in the war, let's say, like France and the British and Italy. So this is sort of the situation around 1912. You have, at this time, the Ottoman Empire has actually shrunk quite a bit. You have the British in control of Egypt. You have the Italians in control of Libya. But you still have a fair amount of the realm controlled by the Ottoman Empire, including parts of the populated parts of Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iraq, what's now Israel, and also the country of Turkey. And Turkey ends up being sort of the last remnant of the Ottoman Empire. So this is what happens at the end of World War I. What was the Ottoman Empire, the only thing that's sort of left of it is the country of Turkey. You now have Syria, that's controlled by France. You have this Mesopotamia, now modern-day Iraq, that's controlled by the British, as well as Transjordan, which is now Jordan, Palestine. Those are connected to its previous territories of Egypt. You have independence now for much of the Arabs in what's now Saudi Arabia. And you also have an independent country of Persia, which is now Iran. So you have a mix, and some of these borders have very straight lines on it, because at the end of the war, when these different parties were occupying the areas, they drew fairly arbitrary lines to divide up where these countries were. And I want to go back to this figure on languages, and so especially highlighting the Kurds here. And one thing you might see, and we're going to look, hopefully you'll have seen the clips where they talk about this, is that there was talk of making a country called Kurdistan. It never came about because Turkey and Iraq and others did not want to give up any land for it, but you have this whole nation of people here who are spilling over into the borders of other states. So these folks are called the Kurds. And the Kurds are the largest stateless nation. They're a group of tens of millions of people, but they don't have their own country. Instead, they live in parts of other countries. The Kurds live in parts of Turkey, parts of Syria, and if you've been watching the news recently, these are the people that are sort of being attacked by Turkey. You also have large groups of Kurds in northern Iraq and also in parts of Iran. Their situation is complicated, especially in terms of the United States, because in Turkey, the Kurds are seeking independence from Turkey. And because of that, Turkey considers them to be sort of agents of terror or an outlaw group. However, in other places, especially, or what had been the case in Syria and has been the case in Iraq, that the Kurds have been an ally of the United States in fighting against the Islamic State or ISIS. However, what complicates the situation is that while Turkey and the Kurds don't get along, Turkey and the United States are both part of NATO, and so as such, by treaty, they should be allied with each other. And so this makes it a complicated three-way situation. Another place with some complicated borders is modern Israel. And modern Israel wasn't created until after World War II. So at the end of World War II, there was you had the genocides in Europe, and that really helped. Well, Jewish people lived in Israel before that. There was a real push for creating a Jewish homeland somewhere near their historical homeland in what had been the historical area of Israel. And so within the Palestine area that had been administered by the British, the United Nations carved up this new homeland. And the idea was that you would have room for both people, Arabs and Jews. You would have two states, an Arab state, which would be Palestine. So under the plan, that would be the area in kind of the yellow color here. And then you have a Jewish state, Israel, which would be in this other color here. However, those, and there's probably too much to go over here, but I'm going to include some clips that talk about how these boundaries changed over time. There was a series of wars between neighbors in Israel, and during those wars, Israel occupied greater and greater amounts of territory. And so those borders have shifted quite a bit. And so now Israel is occupying the Arab regions, including the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And so here's a kind of a modern view of it. You have area gained by Israel in green. You have the West Bank that's occupied by Israel. They're also occupying a little bit of Syria called the Golan Heights, and also the Gaza Strip. And so these are now disconnected from each other and controlled by Israel. One thing that makes the situation complicated, that for peace, the idea is that, well, we could go, maybe perhaps they could go back to a two-state solution where the West Bank would be an Arab country instead of occupied by Israel. But what makes things complicated is that Israelis are actively moving into this occupied territory. So these are incursions where settlements are being created in the interior. And so if this were to become an Arab state, the people who have moved in here would suddenly be on the wrong side of the border, so to speak, and that makes it controversial. All right, so over time, many of these countries who were occupied at the end of World War I begin to gain their independence from the 1920s in Egypt into the 1930s, 1950s, and so on, that eventually you have the independent countries we have today. We have the colonial system breaking down around the world. And so you become, so you have the modern countries eventually sort of become what they are in the period between sort of the 1920s and 1960s. And one other notable thing that's happened more recently is the Arab Spring. And starting around 2010 on, you had a series of demonstrations, protests in the regions, and the overthrow of many of the leaders of some of these countries. Some of these were what you might call dictators, and you had different results in different places. You had, and by the way, this guy, Mohammed Bouazizi, was a fruit vendor in Tunisia, and he's sort of credited with making the spark that lit this thing off, because he was a fruit vendor who was being persecuted by the authorities, and frustrated and in protest, he actually set himself on fire in the streets. And his story moved around very quickly, because you got to keep in mind the time frame, that this is 2010, and this is when social media is starting to take hold around the world, Twitter, Facebook, and so on. And his story helped to spark a lot of unrest, and it moved very quickly from one place to another. You had a diffusion of unrest and a domino effect from one country to the other, as people saw what was happening in their neighboring countries. Now, this came with mixed results in different places. In Tunisia, you actually had an overthrow of a dictator and the establishment of a democratic government. Syria is on the example of where it went really bad, because you had protests from people, the government cracked down with violence, the people started to arm themselves and fight the government, and then you have this really messy, complicated situation that happened in Syria. And I'm going to include some clips that go into more detail on that. It's a complicated situation. Now, speaking of sort of stateless actors, one group that emerged during the civil wars that were happening in Iraq and in Syria was the Islamic State, sometimes called ISIS, sometimes called ISIL, sometimes called Daesh, which is an Arabic word, which is similar. So they started, when the US had invaded Iraq, there was an insurgency that fought back. And as the United States gained ground, the insurgency sort of, retreated into Syria and reformed as the Islamic State. And then they came back with a vengeance and extended control over large parts of Syria and Iraq. And they called themselves a caliphate, that they were trying to create a new sort of empire based on Islamic law, something similar to the Ottoman Empire of the past. So you had this situation here. This is a figure from the book where they controlled large parts of Iraq, large parts of Syria. The other group that they incurred into were where the Kurds live. We talked about Kurdistan a moment ago, and the Islamic State really pushed hard into where the Kurds were living. And that's why the Kurds became an ally with trying to fight back, because they were protecting their homes from the Islamic State. This is from the BBC, a news source that shows the situation in a little more detail, because it kind of includes where the people actually live. You had this complicated situation of the fighting in Syria itself between the government and other forces. You also have the Kurds, the Islamic State, and a really complex situation emerging out of the civil war in Syria and also in the conflicts in Iraq. So that is what kind of forms this really complicated, messy thing going on for this realm, this region of the realm called the Middle East. You have the Islamic State, you have the Kurds, and one thing to note, it's not so much, it's more than just country on country. You have different cultures, different religions, and different factions that are fighting each other within this sort of void of leadership within these countries that are in the civil war. This has also pushed a great deal. We talked about in the past refugees going to Europe, and the conflicts in this part of the world have kind of helped push refugees out. These are push factors that have driven refugees out and into places such as Europe. Okay, another element I want to talk about that has an impact on political geography is natural resources such as oil. And this is a figure in the book showing where there are oil resources. One area that is the richest in oil is the Persian Gulf area. So if you look at the key here, that this darker shade is where you have an intense amount of oil being produced. You have oil in some other places as well, but this is really where the heart of it is, along the Persian Gulf. And one reason is that in the Persian Gulf, that just the rock structure is such that it's easy to get the oil out of the ground. In the past, we've talked about hydraulic fracturing in the United States, where we have to go through a lot of work and use technology to get out the oil. In places like Saudi Arabia, it's a bit easier to get out. And oil is not evenly distributed. You have countries like Saudi Arabia, which are pretty much the top producer in the world. Sometimes United States takes over that spot, but usually Saudi Arabia is. You have other Gulf countries such as Iran, some of the smaller countries. But then over here you have Jordan, who does not have oil resources. And another thing that complicates the international political situation are choke points. That choke points are places where you have these narrow gaps between these seas. For example, from the Mediterranean, you have the Strait of Gibraltar, a little bit of a choke point here. You have the Bosphorus Straits in the area around Turkey. And these tend to be places of conflicts because a small naval power can block shipping traffic within these zones. And so, for example, the Strait of Hormuz is one place that tends to be a flashpoint of conflict between Iran and other countries like the United States, because they have the power to block this area next to the Persian Gulf, which would prevent oil from being shipped out from the Persian Gulf. So some of the impacts on oil, that it transforms the urban environments. You have variable incomes where you have the winners and losers, the rich and the poor. You also have regional disparities. So in Saudi Arabia, you have more wealth concentrated in the coast. You have poor people in the interior. And it also drives a lot of migration patterns where people move from one country to the other to work in oil fields. And also from outside of the realm, you have people from South Asia, Pakistan, who come into the Gulf to work for a lot of these countries who have a lot of oil, but not a lot of people to work in the oil fields. So what I'm describing here, this is called in the book fragmented modernization. This is where you have a mix of modern and rich and traditional and poor, and oil helps to drive a lot of these patterns of fragmented modernization.